Well, this is more of a recommended reading. So Michael Schellenberger who's written a lot of good articles for Forbes, has a really, I think, solid piece on why the green movement hates nuclear and supports renewables. And so we've talked a lot about on the show about this kind of revealing fact that many of the people who say we face a climate catastrophe that requires just this radical transformation of life, including radical restrictions on fossil fuels, also want to ban the best non CO2 alternative to fossil fuels, which is nuclear. And so, in essence, what Schellenberger points out is he says, yeah, a lot of people worry about nuclear safety, but if we're talking about the public intellectuals like Al Gore and Bill McKibben, they know the record, which is that nuclear is actually the safest form of energy. And then when, most of us can fall victim to this appeal to nature fallacy, as he calls it, where we assume that solar and wind must be cleaner and safer and better than other forms of energy because it's more natural. And he says the Greens leaders know this isn't true as well. I mean, they know about the mining and waste that these projects involve and the impact these projects involve because they're also involved in all of these different not in my backyard litigation things where people want to keep out windmills and solar panels from their neighborhoods. And so he says, well, what's going on in that they're so opposed to nuclear and so for solar and wind? And his analysis points out that historically environmentalism grew out of the socialist movement. Whereas, socialists had been saying capitalism was going to get buried by the economic powerhouse. Socialism was going to bury capitalism because it's an economic powerhouse. And that didn't quite work out. So they said, well, instead, the problem with capitalism is that it harms the environment. And then nuclear was this big counter argument for them because it was, well, we don't have to like wipe out capitalism. We'll just build a bunch of nuclear plants instead of coal plants. And that's going to, address all the problems that you say we have. And so, in order to hold on to socialism, they had to attack nuclear power and say, no, we need to remake capitalism, including the energy that powers it. And so that is really the kind of reason that they're against nuclear, and the reason that they're so attached to these forms of energy that in actuality have a huge impact. And as we've talked about, have real barriers to feasibility. And I think there's a lot that's valuable in this whole analysis that he has. But I do think there's a way in which he doesn't go quite deep enough. So I'm curious if you've read it, Alex, or just based on my summary, if you or Stefan have any thoughts on sort of this just general question about the opposition to nuclear.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing because there is this. Ayn Rand certainly makes this point about how the socialists were looking for a new reason to oppose capitalism, and then they came up with environment. One thing that's going on is there is a deep. This is another Ayn Rand point. There's in all forms of collectivism, there is a deep opposition to the mind, to human thought. It's the whole big issue to get into it, but it's not like there is this pretense that socialism was scientific, but the core thing that it does is it enslaves everyone. I mean, by preventing you from owning property, that means that it prevents you from using your mind to dictate the actions in your life. That's really what it functionally does. So it's really enslaving the minds of people. It's not something that values the individual human mind, and that people who don't value the individual human mind don't like there's a big overlap between that and having a deep hostility to technology, particularly new technology. So I don't think it's a surprise that there's just this deep opposition to these fundamental breakthroughs like splitting the atom. People are fundamentally uncomfortable with that. That's one element. So there is a deep technophobia on the left. There's a certain kind of technophobia on the right too, but there is a deep technophobia on the left, a deep disregard for the individual human mind, and then also there's a deep disregard for human flourishing. These socialist and collectivist ideas, they claimed to care about human flourishing, but they always claimed to care about it on this very abstract collective level. And in practice, because there are only individuals, they end up enslaving the individuals and ruining human flourishing. And so there's something about them that believe in sacrificing individual human beings to some sort of higher cause. And thus, that's another reason why environmentalism is congenial to that kind of mentality. Instead of sacrificing the individual to this amorphous collective, you sacrifice the individual to nature. Whereas if you really valued the individual in the first place, then you would have been very suspicious of collectivism. And you would certainly be suspicious of this thing that says, oh, well, we should sacrifice for the ecosystem and it'll somehow all work out and Mother Nature will take care of us. So those are two things where I think the left has a history of being anti the individual's mind and anti the individual's life, and thus, in general, hostile to technologies and freedoms that advance those things. And part of the thing with solar and wind is that a crucial part of them is that they do not work. So it's a different thing to look at what would happen if solar and wind actually worked. And we can already see on a smaller scale with the green movement, in practice, there's all kinds of local opposition to solar and wind because they'll say, oh, it has too much impact on environment. So when one final point about the green movement is just when you're dealing with a movement that opposes something and then claims to support something, if the thing it claims to support doesn't work and therefore doesn't actually need to support it, it doesn't mean that it really supports it. So I don't think of the green movement as actually being enthusiastic about solar and wind. I believe them as actually being hostile to industrial capitalism. And if solar became a key and vital component of industrial capitalism, they would find many reasons to oppose it, including all of its environmental impacts that they downplay now. Stefan, any quick thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I find this highly plausible on the intellectual thought leader level. I think many of the particularly young people that are being motivated by the green movement are just duped into believing things that aren't so. So, in nuclear is the best example. The nuclear waste crisis, which is a completely manufactured crisis, we have a much better idea how to deal with nuclear waste, which still contains a lot of useful energy in the near future than we have with the waste issue from solar panels, for example.
Interesting.